We have been traveling together now for about 4 months in the Gospel of Luke, following the celebration of Pentecost. And Luke's Gospel says that after Pentecost and the Holy Spirit coming down upon the church, Jesus' disciples lived the faith. The journey they took to get to that place was a journey that went through Jerusalem. And for the last 4 months, Jesus has been teaching and preparing his disciples for what is to come. In recent weeks, we've heard him teach about lost things that have been found, a lost sheep and a lost coin, and how there is a great celebration when the lost is found and comes home again. And then he shared a parable about a son who left home and found grace in the arms of his father and went home to the great celebration. He shared a parable about a steward who was surprised to find grace through his master, who could have condemned him and sent him to prison, but instead commended him for having shown grace to others. Then Jesus shared a parable about how grace and compassion are the only ways to live in this world. And we are now just 2 chapters from Jesus entering Jerusalem. Just 2 chapters. He'll make his way to Jericho, and then from Jericho into Jerusalem, he will be welcomed and celebrated. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. That's where we are on the journey. And our gospel lesson says today, the disciples turn to Jesus and say, increase our faith, because they know that it is faith that is going to get them through what lies ahead. Increase our faith, they say, and Jesus talks to them about mustard seeds, a tree, and the tasks related to the work of the kingdom. That's what he talks with them about in preparation for what lies ahead. And the mustard seed, we all know, is a symbol and a sign of faith. It shows up 6 times in the Gospels. As the young people knew, there's a parable of a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all the seeds. But when planted in the ground, it grows up into a great shrub, and the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches and find rest in its shade. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like, Jesus said. Like a grain of mustard seed, which seems so small and grows into something so marvelous. Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, teaches his disciples about a grain of mustard seed faith when they're unable to cast out an unclean spirit. And Jesus says, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you, he says, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed. And today in his teaching with the disciples, he says, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this sycamine tree, be uprooted out of the ground and cast into the sea, and it would obey you. The mustard seed, it's faith. Faith that grows into something powerful and beautiful that you can't even imagine from where you are now. And then he talks about a tree, a sycamine tree, which we think is a sycamore tree, but it's not. We're going to hear about a sycamore tree in just a chapter and a half when Jesus is in Jericho, and Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, and so he climbs up a tree there in Jericho. And what kind of a tree is that? It's a sycamore tree. A sycamore tree is a big tree, spreads out expansively to provide shade, and it grows and lives a good long life, a sycamore tree, beautiful tree. Zacchaeus climbs up a sycamore tree to see the Lord because he's short. We'll probably read that story in a few weeks. But this is not a sycamore tree, this is a sycamine tree. In some translations, it's a mulberry tree, but it isn't a mulberry tree. It's related to the mulberry family, but not a mulberry tree. It's a sycamine fig, and it's not a fig tree, it's a sycamine fig. And if you go to Israel today, you go through Judea and talk to agriculturalists and ask them about a sycamine tree, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. But if you ask them about a bitter fig tree, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. And that is the tree that Jesus is referencing. The bitter fig, the sycamine tree, which is a tree not native to Israel and Judea. It came into the landscape around 700 BC with the Assyrians. It is a tree that has perhaps the deepest root system of any tree in that part of the world. The roots go down 30 feet, which means it can survive in arid climates for a long, long time. It is a fig tree, but it's not a fig tree where you go and pick the fig and you'd open it up and eat it. If you've ever had a fig off the tree and it's nice and warm and ripe, unbelievably delicious and wonderful, and you say, wow, Lord, how could you create such a delicious, beautiful fruit that I just pick and eat, and it's wonderful. The bitter fig of the sycamine tree is so bitter that you can only eat it. It does have nutritional value, so people eat it, but very small bites because the acid in the fig burns your tongue and your mouth. But people do eat it when they have nothing else to eat, a bitter fig. So it has this deep root system and bitter figs. And the root system is notorious for finding its way toward wells and cisterns to find water. And if the root system finds its way to a well or a cistern, it will draw all the water out of the ground and the tree will grow. So it robs the people of their water, and it dries up the land. So this tree would be a tree that you would say be uprooted and be planted somewhere else. And Jesus references this specific tree at this specific time. The sycamine tree, the bitter fig with the deep roots, and the taste of the fig burns your mouth. So he talks about the mustard seed, he talks about the sycamine tree, and then he says, so when you do the work of the kingdom, don't expect to be celebrated and treated like a hero. Just recognize that you have done what you were called to do. That's the lesson, a mustard seed, a tree, and the work of the kingdom. Now, it's interesting that when they put the lectionary together, which are the readings for every Sunday throughout the year on a 3-year cycle, you notice where we began reading in chapter 17 of Luke's Gospel? We began in the 5th verse. What does Jesus talk about in verses 1, 2, 3, and 4? That actually has a tremendous bearing on the mustard seed, the bitter fig, and the work of the kingdom. But they left that out. They don't include it. What Jesus talks about in verses 1, 2, 3, and 4 is brokenness in this world. Brokenness and betrayal and scandal. And that will come into your life. Brokenness and betrayal and scandal. That's the first couple of verses of chapter 17. How do you like that? They leave that out. They leave out the brokenness and the betrayal and the scandal that will come. And woe to anyone through whom it comes. because it brings pain into everyone's life. That's where it starts. Have you experienced brokenness, betrayal, or scandal in your life? It's part of the human condition. We live it. We encounter it. We experience it. And Jesus follows in verses 3 and 4 the recognition that there is brokenness and betrayal and scandal in this world with the teaching on forgiveness. We must forgive, he says. That if your brother sins against you and repents and comes and asks for forgiveness, you must forgive. And if that happens 7 times in a single day, 7 times you must forgive. We must find forgiveness in order to move forward. That's the teaching. And that's what brings Jesus' disciples to say, increase our faith. In this world of brokenness and betrayal and scandal, if we are going to find forgiveness, increase our faith. And Jesus is talking about the community, and it is amazing because what lies ahead for them is brokenness. They're all going to run away. And betrayal, Judas is going to turn him in to the authorities. And scandal, he's going to be arrested and tried and condemned as an enemy of the people. That's what lies ahead for them. And Jesus says, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you can say to this bitter fig tree. And what is unforgiveness in our lives but that bitter fig tree? Things happen in our lives and they bring bitterness to us, and it burns our mouth to talk about them or to consider them. That brokenness and betrayal and scandal comes into our life, hurt comes into our life. And Jesus says you must forgive. But the roots of that hurt go deep. They go deep. And if it doesn't come out root and all, what will happen? It will grow back, just like the bitter fig. It has got to come up roots and all, and cast into the sea, cast into the abyss, where it cannot grow ever again. Brokenness, betrayal, and scandal, when they come, we must forgive. And it takes faith to forgive. Faith and trust in a God greater than us to help us find a path of forgiveness, help us find a way to go forward. And to uproot this and not keep rehearsing it over and over and over in our minds. What could I have done differently? I wish this would have happened differently. We can't go back and do it differently. It happens the way it happens. And to uproot it and cast it into the abyss so that no longer drains our lives of the energy we need to live. Jesus says, the way forward is the way of forgiveness. And he's right. People have found that to be the truth from Good Friday to this day, and we will carry that forward into the future. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you can find it online. There's an organization called the Forgiveness Project, which was started by a journalist in London who began writing about hope for the world with the dawning of the new millennium in the year 2000. It's a new age and a new world, and there's hope and promise, and we're going to go forward together, one family together on the earth. And then there was 9/11, and then the wars that followed. And the world has fallen into conflict and violence. And so in 2003, she began searching for people who had lived through the war and the violence and asked them if they had found a way to live in forgiveness with what had come upon them. She talked with people in New York City whose loved ones died when the World Trade Center came crashing down. She talked with people who were living through the wars. She talked with people who were protesting on one side or the other that war had risen up. And over the years, she's continued to reach across the globe and hear from people who have found forgiveness as the way forward. And amazing stories. Amazing stories. They write hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories, and you read them, and people will say, I'm not a Christian, or I wasn't a Christian, or I grew up in church, but I wasn't really a believer, and then I went through this experience, and it was horrible, and all was lost, and I lost my sense of hope, and my sense of purpose, and my sense of dignity with what I'd gone through. And then I read how when Jesus had been condemned and they crucified him, he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And with those words, they said, they could come to believe. Forgiveness helped them embrace the faith. Philip Yancey writes a lot about forgiveness. In his books, forgiveness comes up over and over and over again. He's studied it, he's worked for it. And he writes about being part of a forgiveness group where it was church leaders had gotten together to talk about forgiveness and the need for forgiveness. And originally it was supposed to be about forgiveness in our lives, because forgiveness is something we are all challenged to live. And everyone lives through things. Yeah, I look at my own life. Are there people I need to forgive? And I think about things that I've lived through, and I think, well, the things I've lived through, I don't really feel a need to forgive people for that. But the people I love, my kids, when they're hurt, when they're maligned, when people undermine them, then I really need to find forgiveness, because that is really hard to forgive. You do something to me, I don't care. My family, my kids, the people I love, that forgiveness is really hard to find. And so Philip Yancey gathered with this forgiveness group. And they talked about forgiveness, but no one was talking about forgiveness in their own life. They were talking about things that happen in the world. You know, these were church professionals and terrible things that had happened in the world. And could you forgive someone if they did that to you? They talked about the school shootings that happened. Could you forgive the school shooters? Could you forgive someone who did something horrible? Is there anything that's unforgivable? That's what they talked about. And then someone in the group said, I thought we were supposed to talk about forgiveness in our own life. And so Philip Yancey asked the group, has anyone here ever had to forgive someone? And they all looked around at each other, and being church professionals, they really couldn't come up with anything. And there was one woman in the group who raised her hand. She said, I have. And then this group of church professionals sat and listened to her story. Her name is Rebecca. She was the wife of a minister. They came into a church as minister's wife, minister's family. They had a couple of kids, 3 or 4 years of wonderful ministry. Kids are in school, everything's going great in the church, in the family, with the kids. They feel good about their life until one day her husband comes in and says, I'm leaving you. And he left with one of the church ladies. She said it was such a shock to her She never saw it coming. But he left with one of the church ladies, and one of the things that happened was she said half the church blamed her. If she'd have been a better wife, he wouldn't have left. Half the church blamed her. The other half of the church didn't know what to do. She said, I wanted to leave the community, but I couldn't leave because my kids were in school and they had friends. And they needed the love and support of their friends to get through the fact that their dad had packed up and left town with a church lady. And so they stayed. And she said, my friends supported me through it. 2 years after the man who became her ex-husband left, she said, I got so tired of the bitterness and the anger and the revenge that I was carrying around. She said, I had to do something. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And Jesus spoke to my heart and said, the only way forward is forgiveness. And so I called him up that night and I said, I forgive you. And I forgive her too. She said her ex-husband just laughed and said, we didn't do anything we need to be forgiven for. Don't you worry about us, he said, and he hung up the phone. But she said she went on with her life, feeling free from the burden of bitterness and anger, regret and blame. Her kids did well in school. She was doing better in her life and feeling better and stronger. 2 or 3 years had passed from the night she had called and said, I forgive you. And right after dinner on an evening, 2 or 3 years later, the phone rang. And she went and picked up the phone. It was the church lady calling and crying because the ex-husband of Rebecca, who'd run off with the church lady, had met someone at a conference in the Midwest somewhere and called and said he wasn't coming home. And so there the church lady was on the phone crying and crying and crying and saying, I thought you were crazy. I never saw it coming. And through her tears, she said, no one else understands, and no one else will talk with me. Can I come to your house and talk with you? Rebecca said she's on the phone with the church lady. 6 years after they had left town together, 3 years after she'd forgiven them, and now she's saying, can I come and talk to you because you'll understand? And Rebecca said there was a part of me that wanted to say, hell no! But that was the part she kept quiet. What she did say was, yes, you can come over. And 3 hours later, Rebecca and the church lady were sitting together in Rebecca's living room, talking about the betrayal they had each experienced, and the bitterness, and the brokenness, and the revenge, and the regret that they carried. They talked and they prayed. Rebecca said, believe it or not, the church lady became kind of a friend. Kind of a friend. And the understanding that they shared wasn't only about betrayal and brokenness and anger and revenge and regret. What they shared was the understanding that forgiveness is the only way forward. That was true for them that night in that living room, and it's true for us as we sit here in the sanctuary of God. We've been through things in our lives and in this world. And if we leave the roots of bitterness in our heart, it will grow again. And that bitter fruit will barely keep us alive. But with faith like a grain of mustard seed, we can say, be uprooted and be cast into the sea, into the abyss, where that bitterness will grow no more. In this world of brokenness, betrayal, and scandal, there is one way forward. Forgiveness is the way forward for us all. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.